My name is Kate Menken. I'm a professor at Queens College and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, CUNY. And what I'm sharing with you today is actually a plenary presentation I recently gave on March 3rd at the annual conference of the New York State Association for Bilingual Education, or NYSABE. And after the conference presentation, I was asked by many people to share the PowerPoints. So after some discussion with the NYSABE Executive Committee, decided this is the digital age. And so I'm making a home video to share with you the presentation that I recently gave at the NYSABE conference. And this video is being recorded now in April of 2017. So some of the events have changed because things are changing every day, but I'll be also keeping everybody up to speed on what's happened in most recent weeks. But this is a very different plenary presentation than the one that I was actually invited to give. The NYSABE conference, what I was invited to do as a scholar in language education policy was to talk about the connection between language policy and practice and practitioners. And when I was first invited to give this presentation, they were very different times. So the title of my talk for today is Bilingual Education Policy in the Trump Era. And I found that I just can't do business as usual. So I wanted to talk about this and talk about it very directly. To give you an overview of what I'm going to be speaking about, I think at times, sometimes we're so in a moment, and like we are right now, we're in the middle of a very dramatic social and political change. And I think it's very hard sometimes to understand where we are without remembering where we've come. So what I'm going to do now is take an opportunity to remember the past as a way to locate the present and prepare for the future. The focus being a connection between policy and practice. So, one of the things that I've written about and thought about a lot is how bilingual education policy in the US is sort of like a pendulum that swings between opposing ends, where we've been in periods where we've been relatively tolerant of languages other than English in US schools, and periods where we've actively restricted the use of those languages in US schools. I'm going to walk you through now a timeline of language education policy in the US. And bilingual education is nothing new in the US. During colonial times, instruction was multilingual. In 1619 is one of the first schools that we know of. It was a Polish medium school. And we know that there was schooling in other languages as well, such as Dutch and German. And then as we move forward, we moved into 1917. And at the 1917 was the start of what was called the Americanization campaign. And when I asked the members of the NYSABE conference what was happening at that time, everybody shouted out, all of the history buffs, everybody knew that we were in the throes of World War I during that time period. And that was when we started to see for the first, new efforts to really restrict the use of languages other than English in the US and in US schools in particular. So for example, in 1919, Nebraska mandated English-only policy, English-only instruction in US schools. Now, that law was actually overturned in 1923, and in 1926, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals actually overturned other English-only laws of the time period. But what it did do was, really from the period of the Industrial Revolution all the way through to the 1960s, instruction in languages other than English was restricted. So I would say that overall, especially from 1917 forward through the 60s, we can say is a period of restriction, of language restriction. And then moving forward in our timeline, we moved into the period of the Civil Rights Movement. And the Civil Rights Act of 1964 in federal education policy was extremely significant because it was the first federal recognition that language can be a source of educational inequity in US schools. It was on the heels of the 1964 Civil Rights Act that in 1968, the Bilingual Education Act was passed. That was Title VII of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. And the significance of that policy was that it was, first of all, it was naming bilingual education. And it was suggesting that schools work to support students who are learning English in US schools. It was, but people in the field who have been in the field for a long time say that It really wasn't until 1974, in the case of Lau versus Nichols, that we really began to see dramatic or more dramatic changes in practices within schools. And that was, the Lau case ruled that identical education does not constitute equal education under the Civil Rights Act. And so what Lau did was to mandate, the Lau case in California, what it did was to mandate that schools need to do something for their multilingual learners. And I'm using the term, by the way, multilingual learners is this term of the state of New York. I'm using it in lieu of English language learners, but that might be a term that you're more familiar with. But New York State now refers to students as multilingual learners, so I'll be doing that. But in any case, what Lau ruled for multilingual learners was that schools need to do something. They need to provide English as a second language services or bilingual education services. So that was very much from the civil rights period through the Lau case. This was very much, oh, and I should also mention that in 1974, right here in New York, was the passage of the Aspira consent decree. Aspira, a Latino federal, civil rights organization, they passed, there was also a case there, and what Aspira did was to not only say that services need to be provided to multilingual learners in US schools, but they actually mandated the provision of bilingual education in particular, particularly in schools where 20 or more students per grade speak the same home language. They kind of went beyond the Bilingual Education Act and Lau by saying, not only that ESL or bilingual education should be provided, but it was actually one of the first mandates that bilingual education per se should be provided. So this was very much a period of tolerance of languages other than English in US schools. And I think, I'm reminding everybody about this. I think that what we've seen in most recent past has been an expansion of bilingual education opportunities, particularly through the expansion of dual language bilingual education programs. But I almost feel that the terming, for example, of these programs as dual language without calling them bilingual education programs as well has had almost a sanitizing function. And I sort of feel like we're forgetting the political and the politicized roots of bilingual education in this country. And so I think it's helpful to turn to the past. 1963, Coral Way was one of the first, or it's the first documented public bilingual school in the US. And it's located in Dade County, Florida, and it was a school that was begun by Cuban exiles. So there's a picture here of Coral Way and a picture of the school. And then soon after that, in 1968, New York City's first bilingual education elementary school was opened, PS 25, in the South Bronx, led by Principal LaFontaine. But again, there are very political roots to the opening of the school. Here's a picture of the school today. But activists disrupted the New York City Board of Education, what was then called the Board of Education, meetings, demanding to be heard. So PS 25 was actually an accommodation to the Puerto Rican community by the then New York City Board of Education. And so, I think it's important to remember that these schools were open due to pressures from parents and due to community activism. So, la lucha sigue. The history of contemporary bilingual education in New York and other states in the US has then these direct ties to civil rights and social justice. And these are programs that were started by and for immigrant communities. So I just thought it would be helpful to sort of remind us of what the roots were here. Okay, so moving forward in the timeline, and I'm going somewhere with all of this, so if you could just bear with me as I continue to walk through this. So that we entered the 1980s, okay, and that's when we saw this resurgence of US English. The main effort of US English was that they wanted to establish English as the sole official national language of the US. They were not successful in doing that, but they did experience greater success doing so at the state level. Quite a lot of states at this point now have established official English-only laws. Those are largely symbolic. They could be used to enforce things like monolingual instruction in English or the denial of translation services in the courts. But as I mentioned to date, they've been largely symbolic. But then in 1998, we saw California's passage of Proposition 227, and then also Arizona's passage of Proposition 203, and Massachusetts Question 1. And all of these were anti-bilingual education ballot measures where voters went to their ballots and they voted to eliminate bilingual education in those states. Now, interestingly, most recently, during our most recent election, California actually repealed its Proposition 227. So, what that means is, hopefully, that now bilingual education is going to be restored in California. But in those states, in the period after those ballot measures, bilingual education was largely eliminated in those states. And moving to the most recent moving forward in federal education policy, in 2002, No Child Left Behind was passed into law, and that was the reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of the time. And what No Child Left Behind did was to repeal the Bilingual Education Act. What it actually did was to expunge and entirely eliminate the word bilingual from all federal education policy. It also set a number of testing and accountability measures. And so, most recently, in 2014, Christian Salursa and I documented the loss of bilingual education programs in New York City schools, which we directly tied to the emphasis on testing in English in New York City for the purposes of testing and accountability under No Child Left Behind. So what we showed was a causal link between the dramatic elimination of bilingual education programs in city schools to that policy. So this was very much, the more recent history from the 80s through to 2002, through No Child Left Behind, was very much, the pendulum swung back into a period of language restriction, where we saw languages other than English being actively restricted in US schools. And then moving forward, I think we're going to look back at this more recent history, at least locally, as a very positive time for bilingual education in the state of New York and in the city of New York as well. So in 2011, in response to an investigation by the US Department of Civil Rights, the city was being required to do more to provide services to multilingual learners in the city. And so they drew a corrective action plan that was adopted between the state and the city, in which the state promised to expand the offering of bilingual education programs in the city. And then in 2014, in the spring of 2014, under the leadership of Angelica Infante, as well as Lisette Colon, New York passed what is called the New York's Blueprint for ELS. And soon thereafter, in 2014, the Part 154 was revised. And Part 154 is the state's mandates about the provision of services to multilingual learners. And in both of these, there's a very strong push for bilingual education, a strong support for bilingual education, the provision of bilingual education, where Part 154 actually even goes beyond Aspira. So it's now required, not only is it required that when you have a school where 20 or more students speak the same home language in the same grade, that bilingual education be provided. It's now, if you have 20 or more students in an entire district who speak the same home language in a single grade, that bilingual education must be provided. So I think we're going to look at this very much as a period of local tolerance, where languages other than English, I have to say that there have never been times that we've really fully celebrated all of the languages of immigrants in US public schools, but we have had these periods of tolerance, relative tolerance, and I think that we'll look back on this period locally as very much a period where there has been tolerance for the languages other than English that immigrant children bring to US schools. More recently, in 2015, was the most recent reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, and it's called ESSA, the Every Student Succeeds Act. I put a question mark here. I don't know if it's going to be a period of tolerance or restriction. I think given the Trump administration, the way it plays out might be restrictive, but it did promise to scale back the testing and accountability mandates, which would be positive for bilingual education. So I left it as a question mark because I think it really remains to be seen. A number of states have started to adopt their implementation plans for ESSA, but that's just beginning. So what does all this history tell us? The reason I'm doing this is that in the US, bilingual education policy has historically been closely tied to immigration rates and to immigration policy. Like these things are not happening, the adoption of these various policies are not happening in a vacuum. So this is a nice chart that I found that was published by the Migration Policy Institute. And what you see in it is that they've mapped, the orange line shows immigrants as a percentage of the US population from 1850 through 2015. And it shows the number of immigrants on the blue line from that same time period. And so this chart is of the number of immigrants and their share of the total US population. So what I did was to map the history of language education policy in US schools that I just documented onto this chart. And so what you see is that right around 1917, that was the passage of the Americanization campaign. It was the first really concerted effort to restrict languages other than English in US schools. That was during a period when the immigration rate had increased and the proportion of immigrants in US schools was also higher. So that was really the first period that we saw of restriction. But look at what happens here in 1960. Those lines go down, both the blue and the orange. So what we see is the 1960s, that was the period of the civil rights movement. And that was also a period when we had lower numbers of immigrants and where immigrants comprised a smaller proportion or smaller percentage of the US population. So that was our period of tolerance of languages other than English that I talked about earlier. And then, wow, look at what happens. The blue line goes way up. I mean, we know that we've received more immigrants within the past 2 decades to the US than ever before in US history. And they're also steadily comprising a larger proportion of the overall US population. And so it makes sense, right? Like you can kind of understand what's happening politically. That again, here, in the early 2000s, you start to see these efforts to restrict and actively restrict the languages that immigrants bring to US public schools. Then we happen to have this period of relative tolerance in New York. Remains to be seen, and time will tell us if that was something that is in isolation or if that's an event that will continue. But in any case, I think it's important now that we talk about the present and remember that the present is changing daily right now. But anti-immigrant rhetoric was central to the Trump campaigns, and we've seen immediate effects of that. For example, the Trump administration's Muslim ban, it was Executive Order 13769, enacted very soon after Trump was put into office on January 27 of 2017. And the executive order limits travel to the US from Syria, Iran, Sudan, Libya, Somalia, Yemen, and Iraq, and by all refugees. And immediately 700 travelers were detained, 60,000 visas provisionally revoked. And then at the time of the NYSABE conference, this was being revised due to constitutional violations. And so it was 3 days after the NYSABE conference on March 6th, it was replaced by Executive Order 13780, which likewise suspends the US refugee admissions program, restricts admissions and new visa applications of citizens from all of the same countries listed above, except for Iraq, which was now removed. It suspends the admission of refugees. But what happened was that on March 15th, so several days after it was put into effect, Judge Watson of the U.S. District Court of Hawaii issued a temporary restraining order preventing the government from actually enforcing several of the key provisions because he reasoned the executive order was likely motivated by anti-Muslim sentiment and thus a breach of the U.S. Constitution. On the same date, Judge Schwang of Maryland reached a similar conclusion. Now, the U.S. Department of Justice has stated, and I quote, that it will continue to defend the executive order in the courts. And then very soon after new immigration policy, the Department of Homeland Security issued a memorandum on February 20th of 2017 that permits far more deportations, aims to publicize crimes by undocumented immigrants, strip such immigrants of privacy protections, enlist local police officers as enforcers, hire 10,000 immigration and customs agents erect new detention facilities, discourage asylum seekers, and speed up deportation. So there's now, for example, there's now a phone number that you can call if you've been the victim of a crime by undocumented immigrants. And it's sort of fostering fear of undocumented immigrants as a population. And these executive orders have also served to really dramatically expand the power of immigration officers in the US. So this is a picture, of ICE, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement. So we've really seen a significant increase now in arrests and deportations. So the Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, crackdowns, we've witnessed many more of these, with hundreds of reported arrests just in recent weeks alone. In the week of February 12th alone in 2017, we saw 600 arrests in 1 week. And so I think it's important now to talk about what's being called the Trump effect. So even maybe if, for example, that executive order, they can't find a way to hold it. The Southern Poverty Law Center has been documenting bias incidents and hate crimes. And just from the day after the election through February 7th, 2017, they documented 1,372 bias incidents that were reported, marking a dramatic increase. So this is a picture. What it says here is Trump Nation, whites only. And what this was is, you can't see the other side of this, but this is actually a banner. It's a sign advertising. It's on a church lawn in Silver Spring, Maryland. And it was advertising their Spanish language church service. So on the other side of this, it says Misa en Español. And we've also seen a threefold increase in new anti-Muslim groups being formed, mosques being vandalized, and Muslim leaders threatened. And we've also seen, this picture is personal and it's harder to talk about, but we've also seen a rise in anti-Semitism. So this is a picture. 75 to 100 tombstones were overturned and damaged the Saturday before the NYSABE conference at Mount Carmel Cemetery in Philadelphia. And more recently, Mount Sharon in Springfield, a number of overturned tombstones were discovered. That happens to be where my grandparents and many of my family members have been buried. It's a Jewish cemetery, and now they're investigating to determine if that too was a hate crime of a case of anti-Semitic vandalism. And what I found at NYSABE was that after I talked about, and I gave this presentation, people kept coming up to me. Many of us have stories, and they were coming up to me with their stories. And so, for example, 3 people that I know were verbally accosted for speaking Spanish within 1 week of the election, and that includes a CUNY colleague who was physically accosted. We also know that 59 Jewish community centers, or JCCs, were targeted and received bomb threats. And these include JCCs where I have friends and family members with children who attend after schools and summer camps. And then after the election, I didn't recognize the Bengali PTA president of my son's school. And I realized, after I saw her, I realized that I didn't recognize her because it was the first time that I had ever seen her without her headscarf, which she was not wearing because she was afraid. And my own son started to have nightmares during election season that my husband, who got his citizenship last summer, would be sent to Uruguay. So there are many, many stories here of this Trump effect, but I think now we need to turn attention to the Trump effect, how all of these things are playing out in US schools. So what the Southern Poverty Law Center has also documented in their recent survey of 2,000 school teachers, is an alarming level of fear and anxiety among children of color and inflaming racial and ethnic tensions in the classroom. So many students worry about being deported. We've seen increased absenteeism locally and overall a general increase in the climate of fear. This is from Austin, Texas, these photos that I noticed recently, so I thought to include them here. These were things that children wrote about how they're feeling right now in school as immigrant students to be in school. The first one says, "I'm so scared." And this one says, yo tengo miedo que se lleven a mi mamá y a mi papá. So I'm very scared that they're going to take my mother and father. I hate you, Donald Trump. So why is all of this? Why am I talking about this, and why is this relevant to bilingual education? Well, first of all, we can't talk about language policy or about bilingual education in isolation from immigration policy. I think that there has been a tendency to do that, but it's not serving our purposes well, for one thing. But secondly, like, this is language policy of the current age, I would argue. And past links between anti-immigrant sentiment and attacks on bilingual education mean that even if bilingual education might not be attacked explicitly yet, and it hasn't, if it hasn't been attacked explicitly yet, I think that we should expect that it will be. Additionally, I think that we can expect, even though we don't yet fully know what new educational policies are coming down the pipeline, we can expect they will restrict languages other than English and defund immigrant education. So on this relevance, I think immigration discourse and policies really stand in direct opposition to our work. So this is a quote from Paulo Freire, and it says, "It doesn't hurt to repeat here the statement, still rejected by many people in spite of its obviousness, that education is a political act." And it is. Education is an innately political act, and I would argue that the sociopolitics engulfing the education of immigrant students right now defines language education policy today and is likely to do so for years to come. So now we need to plan for the future. To quote African-American feminist and civil rights activist Florence Kennedy, what she says, "Don't agonize, organize." So let's organize. La lucha sigue. So immigration policy and our approach to languages other than English in schools have always been deeply intertwined, but never more so than today. With the Trump administration's immigration stance and climate of fear that has come full force into our schools and classrooms, it's impossible for educators to work with multilingual learners without also advocating for them. So we need to start thinking about advocacy as central to our work if we haven't already. And some of you are going to think big and do big, and others will think big and start small. And we need all of these things, and all of it matters, and all of it makes a difference. Tammy Alsace, in her presidential address at the NYSABE conference, talked about advocacy as speaking, acting, writing on a particular issue, policy, or group of people, and it's often seen as working inside the system, whereas activism, she said, was taking direct action to achieve a social or political goal that was part of the broader advocacy process and is seen as working outside the system. So for example, learn who your representatives are and talk to them or contact them by email, phone, Facebook, letter. Attend a march, attend meetings and town halls with politicians or by political organizations. Engage with NYSABE. NYSABE is our community, so engage with NYSABE and its advocacy efforts. Or if you happen to be watching this from somewhere else, engage with your local association for bilingual education. Like the Facebook page of organizations that you support as a way to stay informed. So my choice, for example, locally, is Make the Road New York. I live in Queens, New York, so this is my organization. So pick one and join it. So not only like their Facebook page, but also join the organization and send them money too, if you can. Sign an online petition. Write editorials or send letters to editors. We particularly need teachers to be doing that. We need to hear the voices from classrooms coming out. Comment on internet posts that you see or news articles. Support candidates who support key issues. Give money or vote for them, as Tammy Alsace pointed out. Or just vote for them because that's free. And consider running for political office yourself. So this Alice Walker quote says, Alice Walker, African-American literature writer, says, "Activism is my rent for living on the planet." Learn about immigrant rights and immigration law. This is a Know Your Rights poster from the ACLU in the picture here. And lead a Know Your Rights training in your school. Support immigrant students and their families in your school or your community. Reassure your students and make sure that school is a safe place for them. Because together we can make a difference, and we need to, so please bring your voices and your actions forward so we can hear from everybody. Thank you.